Hello again. This is the last of 3 videos that we're going to be using instead of having class in person this Friday. This lesson is concerned with the body cavities and also the membranes associated with them. So in this sagittal view of the human body, you can see 5 different cavities. Along the dorsal side of the body, there's the cranial cavity, which contains the brain. And inferior to the cranial cavity is the vertebral canal, which contains the spinal cord. On the ventral side of the body, you have the thoracic cavity located in the upper part of the trunk or thorax. And then inferior to the thoracic cavity, you have one large compartment that's continuous called the abdominopelvic cavity, which is spelled just as one word. Now, the upper part of the abdominopelvic cavity, which you see here, is called the abdominal cavity, and the lower part of the abdominal pelvic cavity is called the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity are not completely separated by a partition, however, they are continuous with one another. The abdominal pelvic cavity is also separated from the thoracic cavity by a muscular sheet called the diaphragm. Diaphragm is one of the main respiratory muscles that allows you to breathe. In this frontal or coronal view, you can see that the thoracic cavity is subdivided into the 2 lateral pleural cavities, which contain the lungs, and a medial pericardial cavity, which contains the heart. There's also an area between the 2 lungs that's called the mediastinum. The mediastinum contains the heart, also the aorta, the thymus, and also a few other structures. Then, inferior to the pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity, again, is the diaphragm, which is a sheet-like muscle. And then inferior to the diaphragm is the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is subdivided kind of by an imaginary line into an upper abdominal cavity and a lower pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity contains the liver, also the spleen, the small intestines, the large intestines, the stomach, most of the major digestive organs. Pelvic cavity contains the urinary bladder. In the female, it contains the uterus, and also the lower part of the large intestine. Now, in the pericardial cavity, the pleural cavity, and also the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is also known as the peritoneal cavity, there are 2 layers of thin membranes called serous membranes that are associated with each cavity. One serous membrane lines the inside of the cavity. The other one covers the surface of the organs in that cavity. These serous membranes secrete a watery fluid called serous fluid, which helps to lubricate the organs. Now, within each cavity, the outermost layer, which lines the inside of the cavity, is called a parietal membrane. The serous membranes cover the organs within the cavity are covered by a visceral membrane. The visceral membrane is tightly attached to the surface of the organs itself. And in some of the cavities, like the pleural cavities, the parietal pleura is actually right up next to the visceral pleura. And there's just a thin layer of serous fluid between the two. So the pleural cavity is sometimes referred to as a potential space because there really isn't a gap or a space there because the two membranes are right next to each other, just separated by a thin layer of fluid. So in the pleural cavities, you have a parietal pleura, which lines the inside of the membrane, and you have a visceral pleura that covers each one of the lungs. These pleura allow the lung to slide past the inside of the pleural cavity without producing friction. If the pleural membranes do get inflamed, it causes a very painful condition called pleurisy. In the pericardial cavity, which you see in the left, there's also two serous membranes. The first one is the parietal pericardium, which lines the inside of the pericardial cavity, and then there's a serous membrane that's tightly attached to the surface of the heart called the visceral pericardium. Now, along the lateral sides of the pericardial cavity, the parietal pericardium is actually fused with the parietal pleura, which is right next to it. That forms a sac-like structure that the heart sits in called the pericardial sac. So if you open up the chest wall of a cadaver, it looks like the heart is sitting in a kind of a opaque sac that's slightly transparent called the pericardial sac. So in order to expose the heart, in order to do a procedure such as a surgery, you would have to cut through that pericardial sac to expose the heart. Likewise, in the abdominal pelvic cavity, you also have a parietal and you have visceral membranes. Lining the inside of the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is also known as the peritoneal cavity, you have a parietal peritoneum. Also, surrounding most of the organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity, you have a thin membrane called the visceral peritoneum. Now, in reality, the visceral peritoneum is actually continuous with the parietal peritoneum, but anatomists make a distinction between the visceral peritoneum that surrounds the organs and the parietal peritoneum along the body wall. There's also a membrane that connects the visceral to the parietal peritoneum. That is referred to as mesentery. So there's the parietal peritoneum, which is lining the inside of the abdominal pelvic cavity. And then here is the visceral peritoneum, which is surrounding one of the loops of the intestines. Most of the small intestines and most of the large intestines are surrounded by visceral peritoneum. And I say most because there are some that are not, and I'll explain that here in just a little bit. So this is a mid-sagittal section through the abdominal pelvic cavity. And here you can see the mesentery a little bit better that connects the intestines to the body wall. Also, the stomach and the large intestine are held in place by mesenteries, which are continuous with the visceral and the parietal peritoneum. There are two mesenteries that are attached to the stomach that do have specific names. There's a lesser omentum that is attached to the upper border of the stomach, and there's a greater omentum that's attached to the lower border of the stomach. Now, the greater omentum actually forms a large fold that covers up the transverse colon and also much of the small intestines. And so when you cut open the abdominal wall on a cadaver or on a person, you'll see a membrane that's covering the intestines. That's the greater omentum. And that provides a passageway for blood vessels. Also, there are fat globules embedded in that membrane, so it provides a place for fat storage. And it also probably acts kind of as a cushion to help protect the intestines. Now, there are also some organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity that are attached to the body wall. And so they're covered on just one side with the parietal peritoneum. These organs are referred to as retroperitoneal. And they're really outside of the abdominal pelvic cavity because they're sandwiched between the parietal peritoneum and the body wall. For example, the pancreas, which that top arrow is pointing to, is only covered on the anterior side by the parietal peritoneum. The other side is stuck to the posterior body wall. So it's really not within the parietal peritoneum, it's outside of it, so it's said to be retroperitoneal. The duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, is also retroperitoneal, as is the urinary bladder, the very last part of the large intestine, and the kidneys. Kidneys are probably the best example of a retroperitoneal organ. Kidneys are not shown in this mid-sagittal section because they are to the left and right of the midline. But the kidneys, the ureters, also the uterus, the oviducts or fallopian tubes, and the ovaries, those are all retroperitoneal. So there are quite a few organs that are said to be retroperitoneal. The other organs, like the stomach, most of the large intestine, most of the small intestine, that is completely surrounded by the visceral peritoneum, is referred to as intraperitoneal. That's spelled I-N-T-R-A and then peritoneal. Intra means within, so that means it's within the peritoneal cavity. Okay, that's the last of the material that I was planning on covering from Atlas A, so I hope you've enjoyed your little break from class on Friday, and I will see you again next week, either in lab or lecture.